97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real. How many times have you heard that statement? Probably hundreds. It may seem like a compelling and scientific argument against fossil fuels, but it's one of the most illogical, unscientific arguments you can make. To see how, let's use this form of argument for another controversial product, vaccines. An anti-vaccine person approaches you and says, 97% of doctors say that the side effects of vaccines are real. What would you say in response? You'd probably say, yeah, but the benefits far outweigh the side effects. By saying that 97% of doctors agree that vaccine side effects are real, without mentioning any of the benefits of vaccines, the anti-vaccine activist is trying to get you to look at the potential dangers of vaccines out of context. When fossil fuel opponents say 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, they are doing the same. Yes, using fossil fuels for energy has a side effect, increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, but what about the upside? In the case of fossil fuel, that upside is enormous. The cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy that makes modern life possible, and at a scale no other energy source can match. So how significant is the side effect? This raises another problem with the statement, 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real. It tells us nothing about the meaning or magnitude of climate change, whether it's a mild, manageable warming or a runaway, catastrophic warming. This is an example of the fallacy of equivocation, using the same term in different, contradictory ways. If someone were to say 97% of doctors agree that vaccine side effects are real, what exact vaccine side effects do the doctors agree on? That a certain number of babies will get a rash? Or that large percentages will get full-blown autism? Precision is key, right? But fossil fuel opponents don't want you to know the precise magnitude of climate change, because if you did, you wouldn't be scared of climate change, you would be scared of losing the benefits of fossil fuels. For example, listen to how Secretary of State John Kerry manipulates the 97% of scientists line. 97% of climate scientists have confirmed that climate change is happening and that human activity is responsible, he said in a speech in Indonesia in 2014. Later, in the same speech, he claimed that scientists agree that the world as we know it will change, and it will change dramatically for the worse. 97% of climate scientists never said any such thing. So what did the 97% actually say? It turns out nothing remotely resembling catastrophic climate change. One of the main studies justifying 97% was done by John Cook, a climate communications fellow for the Global Change Institute in Australia. Here's his own summary of his survey. Cook et al. Found that over 97% of papers surveyed endorsed the view that the Earth is warming up, and human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause. Main cause means over 50%. But the vast majority of papers don't say that human beings are the main cause of recent warming. In fact, one analysis showed that less than 2% of papers actually said that. How did Cook get to 97% then? First, he added papers that explicitly said there was man-made warming, but didn't say how much. Then he added papers that didn't even say there was man-made warming, but he thought it was implied. A scientific researcher has a sacred obligation to accurately report his findings. Cook and researchers like him have failed us, as have the politicians and media figures who have blindly repeated the 97% claim to support their anti-fossil fuel goals. How can we protect ourselves against this kind of manipulation? Whenever someone tells you that scientists agree on something, ask two questions. What exactly do they agree on? And how did they prove it? I'm Alex Epstein, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels for Prager University.
I'm an atmospheric physicist. I've published more than 200 scientific papers. For 30 years, I taught at MIT, during which time the climate has changed remarkably little. But the cry of global warming has grown ever more shrill. In fact, it seems that the less the climate changes, the louder the voices of the climate alarmists get. So let's clear the air and create a more accurate picture of where we really stand on the issue of global warming, or, as it is now called, climate change. There are basically three groups of people dealing with this issue. Groups 1 and 2 are scientists. Group 3 consists mostly at its core of politicians, environmentalists, and media. Group 1 is associated with the scientific part of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, or I.P.C.C. Working Group 1. These are scientists who mostly believe that recent climate change is primarily due to man's burning of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. This releases CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, and they believe this might eventually dangerously heat the planet. Group 2 is made up of scientists who don't see this as an especially serious problem. This is the group I belong to. We're usually referred to as skeptics. We note that there are many reasons why the climate changes: the sun, clouds, oceans, the orbital variations of the Earth, as well as a myriad of other inputs. None of these is fully understood, and there is no evidence that CO2 emissions are the dominant factor. But actually, there is much agreement between both groups of scientists. The following are such points of agreement. 1. The climate is always changing. 2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas without which life on Earth is not possible, but adding it to the atmosphere should lead to some warming. 3. Atmospheric levels of CO2 have been increasing since the end of the Little Ice Age in the 19th century. 4. Over this period, past 2 centuries, the global mean temperature has increased slightly and erratically by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. But only since the 1960s have man's greenhouse emissions been sufficient to play a role. 5. Given the complexity of climate, no confident prediction about future global mean temperature or its impact can be made. The I.P.C.C. acknowledged in its own 2007 report that, quote, the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible, end quote. Most importantly, the scenario that the burning of fossil fuels leads to catastrophe isn't part of what either group asserts. So why are so many people worried, indeed panic-stricken, about this issue? Here's where Group 3 comes in: the politicians, environmentalists, and media. Global warming alarmism provides them, more than any other issue, with the things they most want. For politicians, it's money and power. For environmentalists, it's money for their organizations and confirmation of their near religious devotion to the idea that man is a destructive force acting upon nature. And for the media, it's ideology, money, and headlines. Doomsday scenarios sell. Meanwhile, over the last decade, scientists outside of climate physics have jumped on the bandwagon, publishing papers blaming global warming for everything from acne to the Syrian civil war. And crony capitalists have eagerly grabbed for the subsidies that governments have so lavishly provided. Unfortunately, Group 3 is winning the argument because they have drowned out the serious debate that should be going on. But while politicians, environmentalists, and media types can waste a lot of money and scare a lot of people, they won't be able to bury the truth. The climate will have the final word on that. I'm Richard Lindzen, Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at M.I.T. for Prager University.
Carbon emissions are rising, and faster than most scientists predicted. But many climate change alarmists seem to claim that all climate change is worse than expected. This ignores that much of the data is actually more encouraging than expected. Yes, Arctic sea ice is melting faster than models expected, but models also predicted that Antarctic sea ice would decrease, yet Antarctic sea ice is increasing. Yes, sea levels are rising, but the rise is not accelerating, If anything, two recent papers, one by Chinese scientists published in January 2014 and the other by US scientists published in May 2013, have shown a small decline in the rate of sea level increase. We're often being told that we're seeing more and more droughts, but a study published in March 2014 in the journal Nature actually shows a decrease in the world's surface that has been afflicted by droughts since 1982. Facts like these are important because a one-sided focus on worst-case stories is a poor foundation for sound policies. Hurricanes are likewise used as an example of things getting worse. But look at the US, where we have the best statistics. If we adjust for population and wealth, hurricane damage during the period of 1900 to 2013 actually decreased slightly. At the UN Climate Conference in Lima, Peru, in December 2014, attendees were told that their countries should cut carbon emissions to avoid future damage from storms like Typhoon Hagupit, which hit the Philippines during the conference, killing at least 21 people and forcing more than 1 million into shelters. Yet the trend for strong typhoons around the Philippines have actually declined since 1950, according to a study published in 2012 by the Journal of Climate. Again, we're told that all things are getting worse, but the facts don't support this. This does not mean global warming is not real or a problem, but the one-sided story of alarmism makes us lose focus. If we want to help the world's poor, who are the most threatened by natural disasters, it's less about cutting carbon emissions than it is about pulling them out of poverty. The best way to see this is to look at the world's death from natural disasters over time. In the Oxford University database for death rates from floods, extreme temperatures, droughts, and storms, the average in the first part of last century was more than 130 dead every year per million people. Since then, the death rates have dropped 97% to a new low in the 2010s of less than 4 per million. The dramatic decline is mostly due to economic developments that help nations withstand catastrophes. If you're rich like Florida, a major hurricane might cause plenty of damage to expensive buildings, but it kills few people and causes only a temporary dent in economic output. If a similar hurricane hits a poorer country like the Philippines or Guatemala, it kills many more people and can devastate the economy. So let's be clear, climate change is not worse than we thought. That doesn't mean it's not a reality or not a problem. It is. But the narrative that the world's climate is changing from bad to worse is unhelpful alarmism that prevent us from focusing on smart solutions. A well-meaning environmentalist might argue that because climate change is a reality, why not ramp up the rhetoric and focus on the bad news to make sure the public understands its importance? But that's exactly what we've done for the past 20 years. Yet despite dramatic headlines, apocalyptic documentaries, and annual climate summits, carbon emissions continue to rise, especially in rapidly developing countries like India, China, and many African nations. Alarmism has encouraged the pursuit of a one-sided climate policy of trying to cut carbon emissions by subsidizing wind farms and solar panels. Yet today, according to the International Energy Agency, only about 0.4% of global energy consumption comes from solar photovoltaics and windmills. And even with exceptionally optimistic assumptions about future deployment of wind and solar, the International Energy Agency expects that these energy forms will provide a minuscule 2.2% of the world's energy by 2040. In other words, for at least the next 2 decades, solar and wind energy are simply expensive, feel-good measures that will have an imperceptible climate impact. Instead, we should focus on investing in research and development of green energy to lower its costs. So everyone will want it, including China and India. We urgently need a more balanced climate conversation if we are to make sensible choices and pick the right climate policy that can actually help fix climate change. I'm Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center.
Global leaders are gathering in Paris to save the world from the biggest threat humanity has ever faced, man-made climate change, despite the fact that man-made climate change is a crock of shit and human activity has virtually no impact on heating the planet. The UN is trying to get countries to agree to regulations that would limit temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius, despite the fact that corrupt, agenda-driven scientists have been caught over and over again faking temperature data to fool everyone into thinking that global warming is real. The actual figures show there's been no global warming since the late 90s. That means that every single one of these global conferences has been a completely pointless waste of time and money. Their only achievement in terms of altering CO2 emissions has been to belch out millions of tons of CO2 emissions. Global warming alarmists have been proven spectacularly wrong time and time again. In 2007 and 2009, scientists said that the Arctic would have ice-free summers by 2013. By the summer of 2015, Arctic sea ice was the thickest it's been in almost 10 years. Antarctic sea ice also hit a record maximum in 2014. NASA now admits that the polar ice caps are not melting. In 2005, the United Nations predicted there would be 50 million climate refugees by 2010. When this woefully inaccurate prediction failed to pass, the UN tried to delete evidence that they'd made it in the first place. In 2003, the Pentagon released a report predicting that by 2013, climate change would flood California with inland seas and that parts of the Netherlands would be unlivable. In 2000, climate change alarmists said that it would cease to snow in Britain. In 2009, London had its heaviest snowfall in decades, and in 2010, the UK had its coldest winter since records began. You see, they've been proven wrong time and time again because they're lying to you. So why should we believe them now? As the leaked Copenhagen text revealed, the actual agenda behind these conferences is to stop developing countries from becoming prosperous and challenging the unipolar world order. Increasing CO2 emissions, a byproduct of capitalism, are directly linked to prosperity and higher quality of life. Capitalism has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China and India since the 80s. Controlling CO2 emissions is a form of neo-imperialism. This is about power. It has nothing whatsoever to do with saving Mother Earth. And in protesting against man-made climate change, socialists and environmentalists are actually ensuring that poor people in the third world remain mired in poverty. But it's like really trendy to wave banners at climate change demos and virtue signal about how environmentally conscious you are. Meanwhile, these retards are actually promoting the impoverishment and in some cases the actual slaughter of people of colour via UN programs that hire armed militants to drive farmers off their own land so they can seize it to grow biofuels. Programs to stop global climate change are also a complete waste of money and only serve to massively cripple economies. Solar power and wind are virtually useless. It takes 3 decades after installing solar panels just to get your money back. And wind turbines are even worse. They're ridiculously expensive and in many cases emit more CO2 than they save. America has enough oil to last for centuries and could even become a bigger producer than Saudi Arabia or Russia. Yes, we need to find alternative forms of energy, but ones that actually work. As Bill Gates said, renewable energy can't do the job. It's a total waste of money. Green subsidies should all be switched into research and development of technological breakthroughs, not wasted on pointless solar and wind power that is completely inadequate for the world's needs. Also note how these climate change alarmists move the goalposts every single time they're discredited. First they called it global warming, and then when global warming stopped, they called it climate change. Now it's extreme weather conditions, despite the fact that extreme weather conditions are becoming less extreme. And now as a result of decreased solar activity, you know, that giant flaming ball of fire that global warming alarmists say has nothing whatsoever to do with climate change, we're actually about to enter into a new mini ice age, which is a shame because natural global warming actually produces a greener, more fruitful planet and increases the range and diversity of species. The good news is that polls show more and more people have stopped buying into this BS.